what role did the Bible play in as an educational tool?
I was gonna say, wasn't it like the gold or whatever they put to make it look like it was like shiny or something like that?
Yeah.
How would that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, how to manipulate, like
Manipulating people.
Because, I
I'm
mean,
sorry, I thought I was educating people. Okay, manipulating people. Yes,
Yeah,
educating
like,
people.
it had the gold to it to make it look like it was shining almost, like it was holy, he said.
Yeah.
So people believed that there was something important.
Good, good. What else were you gonna say?
Because not a lot of people were educated enough to read, that people would probably like working in the church they would think they're like chosen or like old because they couldn't.
Good, yes, very good. What else?
To build on that, because they couldn't read or anything, they could easily tell them, hey, buy your way out of hell. Give us money.
Exactly, very good. Find your way out of hell. That's
They
exactly
won't
what it
figure
was.
it out.
That's exactly what it was. Do you have anything else to add to this?
Not really.
Okay. Did you have something to add?
I'll just say, I guess it gave them the opportunity to learn how to read. I guess it's more of a side thing, I guess. It's probably not,
Yeah,
not
so
direct.
it's not about manipulating, but it does talk a little bit more about what the benefit of having that Bible become the tool that Gutenberg chose. So to help people to learn how to
mass
read.
market too, kind of like.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have anything else to add to this conversation? Go ahead, Tree.
The church also did like the writings for the Bible, so they were also getting money that way because they're the only ones producing it.
Yeah, so they were charging ungodly amounts of money for just one book. So the equivalent of a couple of years worth of wages. Just that cost by itself. Did you have something to add?
By it being the Bible, it incentivized people to want to read, like, because literature wasn't that common at the time, and the Bible, since most people in Europe were Christian, it was one of the few books that
Good.
actually had interest in reading.
Very good, very good. So it was kind of like that early primer that Dr. Seuss books for many of us, and it's been teaching people how to read and write. And once that became available, once people started to realize that putting these letters together in this certain configuration created whole words and sounds and all of that, then they could start to formulate their own words and their own sounds, and they could start to write their own books. And so it became a learning device for many folks. All right, good, excellent, good round. Kelly, would you mind hitting the lights for us? We're going to go into our next round of lectures. I'm also going to hand out a study guide for you guys for the test, which will be a week from Wednesday. So we're still more than a week away from this, but I like to give this out so that people have the opportunity to know what is going to be important on the test and what's not important in the things that we're talking about in this class. So once it gets to the back, I'll collect the last of them if there's any that are still floating around. All right. So we left off talking about this invention, the steam-powered pump, and how that in turn became a tool that became very, very powerful in creating a new renaissance, if you will, or not even a new renaissance, a new way of thinking that we call the Industrial Revolution. Are we out? There's more coming that way. We call this period the Industrial Revolution, as we start to get into things that are being utilizing steam power to operate them. And I think we started to say the other day that just about anything that you can think of could be hooked up to steam power. We saw innovations start to come along, like trains. People did not have trains before this time because there was no way to operate them, but now with steam power, it could become a very, very powerful tool. Does anybody understand how steam power works?
You mean the physics side, or you mean mechanically, or how?
Mechanically, just in a simple nutshell. Jessica.
You apply a heat source to a tub of water, and the tub of water heats up and produces steam. As the steam is produced, it goes through a windmill type thing, and that windmill energizes or moves something on the other side.
Okay.
That's why water wheels were used and such.
Right. So water wheels is, but actually it's really that in that container with the boiling water, there's a lever at the top that as the steam rises, it pushes into that lever. That lever is attached to a handle that actually like draws down, and then as soon as that steam is vented at the top of that push up, then it all drops down again. So the lever starts to do this, back and forth, as the steam rises and then falls, and then rises and falls, and rises and falls. And you can continue to connect those levers to each other, other fulcrum points, and it creates a whole mess of machinery. And so that's where machines came along, and we started to see steam power used for everything. And what ended up happening as a result of this is that populations started to shift and started to change. It had originally been that before this time of the Industrial Revolution, even though there was a renaissance and all this new kind of thinking, that most of the people lived out in the countryside. Most of the people were agricultural workers, meaning that they were farmers, or they did things that were tied to agriculture. So if you were somebody that made fabric, you usually did it out in the countryside, because the source for making that fabric, cotton, was grown out in the countryside. So you would gather all those materials, and you'd make the threads, and then you'd spool the threads, and then you'd weave them together, and then the fabric would be made right there in your own little cottage industry out in the countryside. And then you would ship that to other places, or people would come to you and buy those things. But when the Industrial Revolution came along, and trains and modes of transportation came along, they started to cluster into larger and larger hubs, cities, because there were more people there, and they could ship things from one location to another location, bring them into the cities, and then ship them out to the country from there. But people started to realize that there were more plentiful jobs available for them in the city as a result of this change in pace of transportation. And so more and more of these small cottage industries, these people that were looming fabric, or people that were growing vegetables or processing foods, like making wheat and flour, they started to move their operations into cities. They were still growing the vegetables and stuff out in the countryside, but they were shipping them into the city, where they were processing them and then shipping them out through all of the trains and the boats and stuff like that were all clustered around these major ports. So more and more people started to use factories that were located within cities, and because there was so much need to operate these factories, a lot of the people from out in the countryside would start to move to the city, which changed the economics for those folks out in the countryside, because more and more people were using less and less of their services and utilizing the ones that were starting to congregate in the cities where they were more plentiful. So the cottage industries died out, and all of these folks started to move into the cities. So what ended up happening was these folks that had been pretty much like peasant class folks started to move to the cities with their whole families, and started to take up jobs in the factories themselves. We saw the cities grow, triple, quadruple, 10 times the size that they had been in a 100 years period of time. So London had gone from a small city itself into a booming metropolis within 100 years' time. And the same thing for Paris, the same thing for New York, the same thing for Boston, the same thing for Vienna, the same thing for throughout Europe. Cities grew, the countryside became less and less populated. And what ended up happening was the whole economics, or the whole idea of class system, started to change around. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But we can see that what ended up happening was, again, this city started to boom with the idea of factories, and of course pollution was a result of that. We also saw a lot of people that were working in the factories that included children, because these families that had been country dwellers were moving out into the city. The means that they had for sustaining their families was different than what it had been before. In the country, if you were a child, you didn't go to church, didn't go to school. That was not really the typical for most households. If you were a farmer, you raised children, and it was very beneficial for you to have a lot of children, because that meant extra hands to work on your farm for this manual labor. But that also meant mouths to feed. Usually they had enough food that they were raising themselves, that they could feed themselves without any problem. But now that those folks were no longer working on farms anymore, they were still having these large numbers of children, but now they didn't have the food supply that they did before. So what they ended up doing was they sent their children off to work in the factories too. children were working side by side with grown-ups for these jobs, being paid less money because they weren't full-sized. But they actually were incredibly dangerous situations. And most of them, again, were living in very poverty, squalid conditions. You can see the children here, at least that one child in front is barefooted, working in a factory. Think of all the things that could possibly happen. He could drop something on his foot. He could get his foot stuck in a machine. He could step on something that's sharp and pointed, which often happened. There are lots and lots of documented cases of children with one leg or one arm that were living as part of the population in this time in Europe. Regardless of that, and again, we'll get more into the social aspects of this. One of the things that helped to change the graphics world was when steam power was hooked up to the printing press. And so we have the first printing press that was developed in 1814. And let me see my notes on this. Give me a second here while I change this out. I need to change my view. Save this, and where's my slide? This is in my book. There we go. Right. Now I can see what my notes are. And I'm only saying this because I want to know how long it took to do this thing. So, yeah. So, according to my notes, this first steam-powered operation could print, single-handedly could print 400 sheets of paper per hour. Now, that's actually a lot to think about it. If you think about how many, that would be divided by 60, 400, so that would be about 6 sheets of paper per minute. So you can think about that. It's about the same equivalence of a Xerox printer, or maybe a little bit slower than a Xerox printer, but outputting 6 pages per minute, and to add up to about 400 sheets per hour. If we compare that to when Gutenberg was producing his printing his printing presses, he had 6 printing presses operating at the same time, and he could produce 300 prints per day. So you multiply 400 times 8, that's 3,200, so this is tenfold the speed of what Gutenberg could produce off of 6 printing presses. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty fast. So you can see how this was a very beneficial thing, because people prior to this were still working off of that same kind of hand-cranked press that Gutenberg had developed. Within a couple of years, by 1815, another printing press was developed that could produce 2,400 prints per hour. That's 6 times faster than that. 6 times faster than the one that had just been developed 4 years prior to that. So you can see pretty remarkable speed. And what ended up happening was to meet the demand from the population, the things that were being produced were things like newspapers and magazines. This larger population, this larger number of people that were more and more literate as they were going along, were demanding reading material. They wanted to know what the latest and greatest of the news was. And there were a lot of newspapers and magazines that were competing within the same town. Some newspapers were putting out 2 editions per day. So they had a morning edition and an afternoon edition. It was not unheard of for any given city to have 2 or 3 or 4 newspapers all competing with each other at the same time. So you would see people constantly trying to beat each other to the news, to the story, or sensationalizing the stories in different ways. And different newspapers started to have different kinds of characters as a result of this. And it's kind of the same way that we have tabloids now, whereas the news is sensationalized in some publications, and some of them consider themselves more fact-based.
Broadway, play called Newsies, they're sort of the same idea.
Yeah, so this competition, and you'd see these kids, these newsboys that would stand out in the corners, and they would put on whole acts, whole shows to get people to buy their newspapers. The newspapers business was booming at this time. They were doing great. However, despite the fact that the newspapers could produce, they could print things much faster, there was one facet of their newspaper production that hadn't changed from the time of Gutenberg. Can anybody guess what it was? What do you think?
The ink.
No, actually ink had improved too. It could print faster or dry faster. What else?
The alloy that
What's
they
that?
used, the metal that they used for the letters.
Nope, it was still the same kind of metals. They were still using the same kind of metals. Anybody else? What do you think?
I'd have to say something along the lines of what word density or something, the amount of like space. What?
Not quite. What do you think?
The materials used for the paper?
No, in fact, they had already developed like paper and rolls. So they had already figured out how to do web printing even, so they could do large amounts. Did you have another thought on this? No? Okay. It was the method of typesetting.
Okay.
Think about this. From the days of Gutenberg, he had all of these metal slugs that he were compartmentalized into little drawers, little files, little boxes that you would go through and you would pick each one of them for the typesetting. That had not changed. They were still doing that in the days of these newspaper productions. Newspapers could produce newspapers much, much faster as long as they had the material to put into the newspaper. And the people that they would just kept on hiring more and more and more people to composite, to set the type. But it hadn't improved. And so the newspapers in the late 1880s set about a way to automate typesetting. They figured, well, we've got machines that can print things faster. We have machines that can make fabric really fast, or we have machines that can cut wood really fast. But we don't have anything that can set type faster. So they put out a big competition in New York. Actually, they put out a competition, and they offered a prize that was worth $500,000 in that day. $500,000 to the inventor who could create a machine that would reduce the time of the typesetters by about 25 to 30%. They wanted to lay off 25 to 30% of their workforce to save money. And they were offering, they felt that this was such a booming industry that they could afford to offer this huge, huge prize. I mean, think about that. In the 1880s, $500,000 prize would be worth like hundreds of millions of dollars today. That's incredible. That's incredible. That's what they were offering. They were offering this huge prize to the inventor who could do this. And there were a lot of guys that tried this, that tried to come up with the means to do it. Edison tried to come up with a way to do this typesetting machine, and there were a lot of other people that were playing with it. The guy who did it, his name was Ottmar Mergenthaler, and he's important because what he did was he created a machine that didn't just take away 25 to 30% of the work of these typesetters. It reduced labor by 85%. 85% of the compositors that had been hired to do typesetting before were laid off after this machine came around. This machine was based upon this, again, component of what Johann Gutenberg had developed, the idea of the matrix. So the matrix was the key element within this machine. In fact, it wasn't just one matrix per character, but he created a whole slew of the letter H, the letter A, and the letter D, and all of that stuff. He had this machine that was rigged with dozens and dozens and dozens of matrices that were identical to each other that were lined up in this machine. And the whole machine itself was like a typewriter setup. It had a keyboard that looked like kind of like a typewriter. But the whole thing was about the size of a tree house, if you will. It was a really big monster of a machine. And what would happen is, as the keyboard operator would sit down at this machine, he would start to type, and as he was typing each letter, one of those matrices would fall down into a slot. So you had a whole line of whatever words you were typing out, the matrices for each of those words would slide into the slot in front of you, or within the machine. And then when you reached the end of the line, that whole line of matrices would slide into another part of the machine, and from there, hot metal would pour into those slots, into those matrices. And in the end, it would spit out a whole line or a whole slug of that type. So it wasn't individual letters that were like what Gutenberg was doing by creating each one of those, using each one of those matrices to create an individual letter. It was creating a whole line of type. And so instead of having this where all the letters were falling apart, you'd have a whole single line. You could stack those up one on top of each other. Here's what that machine looks like. So you can see here's the keyboard operation, and then all this, the characters are the matrices are lined up in slugs here, and then it goes into this machine and pours in the hot metal and so on. And the really cool part about this was when you were all done with this, when you had all of your type set, and you printed your newspaper, you could take all of those letter forms, and instead of having to sort them out individually, which is part of the compositor's work, they had to, once they were done printing, they had to clean them up and put them back into the cases. They didn't have to do that anymore. They could just take those metal slugs, put them back into the machine, it would melt them all down again, you could start all over again. So they didn't have any need to repeat, the fifth line of the fourth paragraph again and again and again. They would just take that entire slug of type and melt it down. And that was great. And that changed the whole way that newspapers worked. When the New York Tribune editor saw this, he complained to Ottmar, American fellow, Ottmar, you've done it, a line of type. And from that day forward, this became known as the line of type machine. And again, within a decade, the jobs of these compositors went by the wayside. They were fired, and instead, what replaced them was roomfuls of these machines. And just the operators needed to operate these machines so they could use them with faster and faster typesetting. So this all kind of fit into this idea of doing multiple letters and words doing words and so on was really important when in working in large quantities. It wasn't so much used for advertising as it was for newspapers and magazines. But there was a version of this machine that was used for creating headlines, so that it could do the same thing. You had different machines set up with different fonts that could be used for headlines. And that was kind of important also because they were using advertising more and more these days. Now, advertising did not exist the same way that we think about advertising now. It wasn't until the 1860s that the first ad agency came along. And that agency actually wasn't doing advertising the way we think about advertising. All they were doing was they were going around and buying space in newspapers and then reselling them to different businesses so that they could create their own little ads and put them into those spaces. So the first advertising agencies didn't even do advertising, they just bought space. But as time went on, they started to use newspapers for advertising. Prior to the 1850s, 1860s, when this first ad agencies, 1870s, when those first ad agencies came around, people weren't using newspapers for that purpose. They were using it strictly for news, so there was no advertising section in newspapers. And it wasn't until later on that they started to put together, this is something that people see all the time. We'll use it for creating announcements and advertisements. Before that, they used posters to advertise, or flyers, leaflets that they would hand out on the streets. And that was how people got their news. And you have to imagine how inefficient that would be if you were living in a city that had thousands and thousands and thousands of people living in it. Because as cities get bigger, the space between one neighborhood and the next get further and further apart. And it's just like, okay, so what happens in one part of town might not have any effect on what's happening in another part of town, but then there might be something that both parts of town need to get together for that information. And if you don't have advertisement to communicate, or word of mouth to communicate between them, then you have to rely upon, basically finding spaces that you could post that information. In Great Britain, they had something called hoarding sites that they constructed for passing this information. They tried to make them central to various parts of the town. So like in Cleveland, it would be the warehouse district. They would have a hoarding site, and then it would have down in the flats, they would have a hoarding site, and so on. So you can go through the different sections of just downtown Cleveland, and they would, if you were going to use this relationship, you'd say that they all had hoarding sites. A hoarding site was basically a hangout or an area where postering was allowed. In Great Britain, you were not allowed to hang posters up any place in the city except in these hoarding sites. And so they made them large alleyways or large corners or squares themselves. And people would come into these squares every day and hang up their posters of what they were trying to advertise. So if somebody was putting on a play or putting on a show, or they were coming, there was a speaker that was coming, or if they were trying to sell something at a ridiculously low price, they would create a poster and hang them up in the hoarding sites. But because these spaces were limited, after a while, people would start to cross over what your posters were and put their own posters up in place. So in the course of the day, if you were hanging out at a hoarding site, you could see one set of posters go up, and by the end of the day, you couldn't see that poster at all. It's so covered over with other And so you can start to see how much of a hodgepodge and conglomeration of images and words that came up in these spaces. Hoarding sites became kind of popular for people to hang out in. And you see here that we have some folks that are sitting around and they're eating baked potatoes or serving food or whatever and standing around gossiping. So this hoarding site is a really popular place for people to hang out in. But more than that, more than just the popularity of these spaces were instrumental in passing information along. And the information was passed through posters. What do you see that these people were doing that were creating these posters that would make them stand out from the rest of the other posters that are there? Yes.
Bigger font.
Bigger
size.
fonts, yes.
Colors. And
Colors. What else? Anybody else? Bigger fonts. What else?
Maybe like less writing, so it makes it less complicated, like more eye-catching, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because
What
it
else?
just seems like
Yeah, good. What else? What do you think? Kelly?
Pictures on them.
Okay, some of them have pictures on them. Good. Anybody else notice anything else? What do you think?
The shading around like the typography.
Okay, so there's like drop shadows and
Yeah.
stuff like that start to appear, so they're trying to do things to make the words stand out. Anybody else? How about the decorative quality of those letters? We start to see that letter forms weren't just like regular letter forms, but now they were starting to get really ornate in those characters to try to make them stand apart from everybody else's. And as was pointing out, they were made really big. This is the beginning of what we call wood type. And wood type is still using the same operation as letterpress or relief printing, the same kind of operation that Gutenberg was using. However, the difference here is that the letters were made out of wood. Unlike what Gutenberg had done, which was movable metal type, now we're working with, instead of metal type like this, now we're working with type that's made out of wood. Why do you think they used wood for this? Why do you think, Jessica?
Because they use such big fonts that metal would be clunky and heavy.
Yeah.
and expensive, probably those guys back then.
Good, yeah, expensive. What else? Clunky, heavy, what else?
Probably easier to shape and form, I would imagine. I mean,
Yeah, so I think about innovation and invention that was happening in this time. One of the innovations and inventions that came along was routers. So people could start to figure out how to route out of wood and do it so that it's replicated over and over and over again, the same figures, the same shapes, over and over again, done through tools, through mechanics and machine operation. So a guy, what's his name? Sorry, I can't remember what his name was. Darius Wells, that's it. Darius Wells came up with a machine, a router, that could route out wood. Now, one of the things that we had said about why Gutenberg chose metal over wood was because of the carving quality, right? And also making sure that it was replicated from letter to letter to letter. If you had a matrix or a master that was made out of metal, and then you were using that as the form for cutting out all of these wood letter forms, you could mass produce many of the wood characters at a very inexpensive cost. You didn't have to melt metal anymore. Metal has a tendency, when it gets really big and heavy, to start to dip in the middle, whereas wood, you can sand it down so it's nice and smooth. And on top of it, in the size that we're seeing here, somebody pointed out how simplified the letter forms or headlines were, not using a whole lot of letters. So in the biggest sizes, like that one that says Pompeii, you have 2 letter P's that you're using in that whole line of type, 1 letter O, 1 letter M, 1 letter E, 1 letter I, or maybe 2 letter I's. That's it. So if you only have to create a couple of characters for each of the letters, a couple of versions of each of the letters, that means that you have an opportunity to just make any kind of fonts that you want to. You're not going to be producing long strings of words. They're not going to get, those letters aren't going to start to disintegrate or fall apart for a very long time. And even if they did, you have a matrix that you can just carve out another piece of wood to make it. So this wood type font, these wood type fonts became very popular for posters, for display. And so to this very day, when we start to look through font choices, when we look through the lists, if we go into InDesign or Illustrator and we look at all of our font opportunities, we still have a whole range of fonts that we can choose from. Most of them are display fonts. and how we can tell that they're display fonts is there aren't a lot of choices in them. They were meant to be used for really large sizes, and sometimes they would come down a little bit smaller in size, but they weren't meant to be used in a lot of different variations, usually just in one variation, and they were meant to be used large, because as we start to go down in size, you can start to see the thin parts of the character start to fall off, they become less and less legible. These fonts were purposely made to look crazy, to be intriguing. And again, here you can see a type drawer, and you can see that they only store about 4 or 5 versions of any of these characters, maybe 10 of them, of the eyes up here. But even then, you can see that because they're wood, they can even do stuff like this, where they can cut out a portion of that letter form if they're going to do an illustration, or have the image fit around an illustration, or if they're going to insert other parts, like things like this, where we're having this kind of decorative element that's added to the type. This period of time, their goal entirely was to draw attention to the type for those great big hoarding sites, for massively produced or massively large posters, to draw attention, to make their posters stand apart from everybody else's posters. And it got kind of crazy. You know, it was like, okay, this is certainly not something that you would use for small copy. And so again, when we're looking through all of those various fonts that we have available to us today, we have to be careful about all of the ones that we see, because they are not necessarily meant to be used for body copy. They were meant to be used for headlines alone, and for that we call them display fonts. You can tell that they're display fonts because you will only find that there's maybe 1 or 2 style choices available in those fonts. Maybe it comes in regular and italic. Sometimes they don't even have that choice. Maybe it only has the regular version of it. You don't even have a choice of bold. That's it. That's the choice. That's when you know for sure that you will have a display face. The less choices that you have, the more chance that that font was designed for display purposes only, meaning that it should only be used in headlines at very large sizes. Okay, so that's just a clue to you guys in choosing fonts and figuring out, which fonts that you're going to be using. The other thing about the wood type posters and what they were doing was the other thing that's interesting about this was the way that these were constructed. Let's look at the poster here. Let's start to talk about the design, the structure, how this works, how we understand the design here. Anybody notice anything about this poster that stands out to you? What do you notice, Kelly?
In different sections.
Okay, so very horizontal sections, right? Throughout. What else do we notice?
Several different kinds of fonts and
All kinds of different fonts. Yeah.
hierarchies all over the place, I guess.
And that's the other thing, hierarchy. What's the most important thing up here? And how do we know it's the most important thing?
Probably the gems that seems the largest, and
Maybe, maybe not.
I don't know. Yeah,
That's not street theater, because it's at the top.
Yeah, but why isn't that the most important? Why isn't that the biggest thing on the page if that's the most important part? So we have all of this competition going on for hierarchy. That's, again, a very endemic trait of these wood type posters. Anybody else notice anything about these posters? What do you notice?
All capital letters.
Good, all capital letters. What else?
There's some small print on there, probably trying to get you closer.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but even when we have the small print, anybody notice anything about the small print? Not that you're really able to read. Go ahead, Adam.
is the Irish line, is it slightly blurry or jagged around the edges of the
I
line?
think
Or is it
it's
the
fine.
projection?
It's got like an outline around it.
Yeah, okay,
Just a
yeah, I'm
bad
Shouldn't
slide
get my
for
eyes
the
checked or something.
Yeah, just a rastered slide. Anybody else noticing anything about this? Where's the white space?
What white space?
Exactly. Exactly. White space. This is the term for having a fear of white space. There's a term for this. It's a Latin term. It's horror vacui. Horror vacui. Fear of emptiness. Fear of white space. And this was a very big part of the compositions and what we would call Victorian aesthetics, the tastes of the people that were living at this time. Horror vacui. So I don't have a pen here. Just horror vacui, fear of white space. And this was because this was the prevailing trend in this time. People saw a piece of paper and their goal was, for most of them, to fill up that piece of paper with everything that they possibly could fill it up with. So they were not interested in using white space as we would use it now to move the eye. Now, we recognize that when you have white space, it kind of pushes your eye to the most important information. So the more empty space that you have, the better it is for your design because it helps to push you into the areas that you're trying to draw people to. Creates contrast between density and lightness. But here, they weren't game to that. They didn't get that idea. They saw a piece of paper as real estate, and they saw it as an opportunity to use up every space, every amount of white space that they had available. So that's part of the reason why when we look at Victorian designs, we see all of this decoration on top of decoration on top of decoration on top of decoration, pattern, 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 because they had this intrinsic fear of white space that was very much a part of the taste and the culture of the time. The reason why it shows up on these posters is, well, partly because of that level of taste, partly because the people that were creating these posters were not educated designers or artists. They didn't recognize how white space, again, moves your eye, or how you want to try to control the way that people are looking at things. The people that were doing this were tradesmen. They were print specialists. That's all that they did. They printed day in, day out. They were not artists in any way. They weren't trained as artists in any way. So their goal was to, for the sake of the client, for the sake of the person buying this ad, to make the letter forms as big as they possibly could to fill up the space and to use all of the information that they were given and to use it to fill in the entire pages. And here we can see how that lays out and how it starts to look like a real hodgepodge of things. And when we start to look at these posters, even though they become, again, a hodgepodge, a lot of information that's being displayed on them, we also can recognize that there's sort of a quality to them that is interesting today. And we're seeing a revitalization. So these wood-type posters have kind of come around again. We're starting to see people using this as a skill. The cover of your book is kind of an exercise in wood-type posters. So when we look at this particular poster, we might notice some things that are odd about them, and this is part of the reason why people are kind of like turned on to this idea of letterpress and wood-type printing again, and it's seeing a resurgence. What do we notice as odd about this particular poster from 1876? What do you notice, Adam?
What's it? 3 dots below Philadelphia.
It says VIA. That's the one.
VIA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, because it put down. Okay, now I see the smaller line. So just.
What do you notice?
The way like Centennial is, the C is like bold, huge, and Tennial is
Right.
tiny.
Anybody want to guess as to why that happened? That's all about?
Oh God, back of my tip of my tongue. Shoot.
So again, these guys, their job was to fill up the space. So maybe they had already put together the letter forms for ENT and then IAL exclamation point, and they realized that they had a little bit more space for that letter C than what they had originally planned out. So instead of finding or going back in and spacing out each one of those letters and putting a slug in between each one of them to space them out so it would hold everything in place, they just went into a drawer, found another letter that was sort of the same height, and put it into that spot because they didn't care. Their job was to fill the space. The same thing with the letter E on excursion that you see there, or the B or the P here in Baltimore and Potomac. So they're just kind of like using the tools that they had available and swapping them out just to try to fill up the space. It's another trait that we see in these wood-type posters, the idea of filling everything all the way to the edges as much as they possibly could. So this one's a little bit easier to tell what the hierarchy is because we read it from top to bottom, but we still see that as everything's kind of compartmentalized, and we still don't know, how important is that price versus the idea of these excursion tickets. So over and over again, we see these kind of qualities that show up in these wood-type posters. Sometimes they're a little bit better than others, but overall, what we see is this plenitude of information filling up every every square inch of space that we have available, very little white space, horizontal orientations in the posters. Why didn't they go vertical? Why didn't they go diagonal?
If you run the math, if you do the math in geometry, it's like, because you get more space or something. I guess they mathematically figured it out.
Because of the size of the
Exactly,
blocks
yeah.
that they were working on. They were stacking blocks side by side. So if you started to try to go sideways with them, then you would have to have triangular shaped blocks at the bottom of the form to kind of wedge them into that space. So they didn't have diagonal, and they didn't do this way because sometimes they might try to do this, but they didn't really play with this idea of going sideways very often in the work that they did. So wood type, I'm just going to pass this around so people can see how it feels, how lightweight it feels. I also have the metal type, the 3 little letters, and you can hold these in your hands and hold them side by side with that wood block, and you can see what the weight difference is between the two of them. The wood block is not much heavier than those 3 little pieces of metal type by comparison. So in any case, this became a very plentiful tool and a very plentiful way of printing in the mid-1800s. We don't see a lot of illustration added into this because to illustrate you would actually have to, you couldn't just go to a drawer and find an illustration, you'd actually have to hire somebody to carve out a wood block to create that illustration. So illustrations were rather rare in these posters. Using second or third colors in this was again another operation that took time away from production. And the goal of these guys when they were doing them was to produce these as fast as they possibly could because those hoarding sites were there and people were already covering over their posters. They had to produce more so that they could cover over the posters again and come back at the end of the day and make sure that their posters were hanging. So the posterers, these guys were in constant fierce competition to keep up with having their posters be the most visible in those hoarding sites. At least in Great Britain, that's what the goal was. And then there was the invention of something called lithography, which is another form of printing. Lithography literally means stone printing. Stone printing. Lithography equals stone printing. And lithography was developed by this guy, his name's Alois Sonnfelder. And it was developed in 1796 really is when he developed it, although it didn't really become widespread until the 1800s, at the same time that letterpress was in its heyday and we were seeing this plentitude of wood-type posters. Alois Sonnfelder was looking for a new way of printing. He was actually a playwright, so that meant that he authored plays. That was what he did. So when you were a playwright, you might create a play that had multiple parts. You might have a cast of 10, 12, or even more people than that. And in order for everybody to have access to your play, they all had to have a script. But if you were going to a printing company, a printing press, you weren't printing one copy of something. You were printing hundreds of copies of something. So in the case of Sonnfelder, he didn't need hundreds of copies produced of his plays. He just needed a couple dozen copies of his plays being reproduced over and over again so each of the cast members could have their script. But if you didn't have that, then usually all they would do is they would hand out the lines to each of the different players of just what their lines were. And so they had to memorize their lines without actually knowing the full context of the play, which made the plays poorer because you didn't know what was supposed to happen from the beginning to the end until you'd acted it out a few times. So Sonnfelder wanted to alleviate this whole issue, and he wanted to have whole scripts that he could hand out to his cast members. And so he started to look around for ways to do this, and creating his own little printing company to do this in. He recognized that there was a need. So he started to experiment, and he was playing with different kinds of printing methods, but he was still finding that in order to make this efficient, he still had to go through a lot of different prints in order to get one script output. And in the end, he decided that he started playing with different materials, and he started to realize that when you had like oil pastels, anybody here ever played with oil pastels before? A few of you? What happens when you put a piece of paper out against the oil pastel?
It comes off of it.
Offsets onto the other sheet of paper, so you can have one image that prints onto a second sheet of paper. So that's because there's the surface, the oil itself, is rather fluid, and so it never really quite dries, and so it will, as long as there's enough of it, it will print onto not just one piece of paper, but you can keep on doing that multiple times. And he recognized that oil had this great quality to it of not drying very quickly. And then he started to think about oil and how you could prevent oil from transferring, and he thought about properties. What is naturally repellent to oil?
Water.
Water, yeah. So if he could do something where he was combining the ideas of oil and water together, he could create perhaps a possible way of creating ink that would offset onto another surface as long as he was combining those methods together. And it seems like it's really complicated. But really it comes down to this decision that he made to create a new form of printing. This is called lithography, and again, it means literally stone printing. The big difference between what lithography is and what relief printing is and engraving is that there's no carving involved in lithography at all. No carving whatsoever. Whereas with relief printing or engraving, you're either carving to create a raised surface or you're carving to create a recessed surface, but one way or another, you're carving into something. With lithography, you're drawing directly onto a stone surface. Now, the stone that he chose to work with was a limestone. Limestone has the quality of being a very porous stone. It's the same stone that is where we find caves. Caves are made from sandstone or from limestone because it's a very porous stone, and water washes through it very easily. So this kind of stone is, if you look at it in microscopic version, it looks kind of like a sponge. It's got all kinds of holes in it, and those holes will hold on to the water. It will also hold on to oil if you draw into the stone itself with oil. And so he realized that through different kinds of ways of writing, whether it's pencil or with as if it were pastels, or if you could even use washes that were made out of oiled ink, you could draw onto a stone and any kind of variety of sources of different ways. So the way it looks when you're doing this, and forgive the part that's invisible, but oil doesn't really need to have pigments in it when you're working with it. None of us have cooking oil that actually has color to it. We work with
Hope not.
yeah, if it has color to it, well, that's kind of scary. But by having, in this particular case, he took a piece of this limestone, sanded it down so it was really, really smooth, and then he drew a picture on top of it, or painted a picture with an oil wash. So there's the brush and there's the hand that's washing it, or drawing into this limestone. Now the limestone starts off as just a naked piece of limestone, nothing treating it at all. And then he draws the image just into certain areas with the oil. And then once the oil saturates into that limestone, then he takes a sponge with water in it, rubs it over in the entire surface. The water saturates into those areas that haven't been treated with oil, but the areas that were treated with oil, they repel that water, so it pushes away from those areas. And then by taking ink that is also oil-based and rubbing it over the surface, rolling it over the surface, you can put a piece of paper down, and the combination between that wet stone area and the oily stone area will produce the image. You can pull off that image and you can ink it over and over and over again. So long as that limestone is wet, it has moisture in it, has water in the non-live areas, you can keep on producing image after image after image. And this is the basis of lithography. No carving anywhere in this. And the thing that was really nice about this was that the ink itself could be created as very transparent. So you could start to layer one ink over top of another and create color as a result of this. Further, because you didn't have to use something that was solid letter forms like you did in wood type where you had to carve it into a shape, now you could do something that looked like it was drawn with a pencil, or something that was painted with paints, or it could be cross-hatched like you would do with pen and ink. So you could do all kinds of different techniques and create something that had tonal range and variance in it. And by using that idea of overlaying one color on top of another because of the transparency of ink, you could create a whole range of colors. this idea of using multiple colors is called chromolithography. Chromo meaning color. Color lithography, chromolithography. And Senfelder, again, went on to explain this idea. By 1819, he predicted that chromolithography would take off, and by the time we get to the 1830s, it did. It was starting to be used. The one drawback to this was the way that it was produced. It was slower. It was slower because you actually had to have somebody drawing this image onto a stone or onto multiple stones. So it wasn't like you could go into a compartment, into a drawer, and pull out letter forms and just like slot them into slots and put this whole device together and then crank it out within the same day. To do lithography, it took a lot of time to draw those images. But they had no limits to how big a stone could be. The stones could be really big. They could be the size of 4 of these tables all put together. So you could have really huge stones. And as long as you had a press that was large enough to accommodate that, you could produce things in a piece of paper that's large enough to accommodate that. You could have really huge images. The presses, yeah, they hooked them up to steam power, of course, just like everything else, but it was that time frame of actually building, of constructing the form itself that slowed things down. They called the first steam-powered presses lightning presses because they could work as fast as the other presses worked. It was just the time frame to create that piece of art that slowed them down. However, lithography became superior in many ways to wood-type posters. What do we notice about this particular poster? What do you notice?
It's a lot less text.
Lot less text, yep. What else do we notice? Yes?
It seemed more like an art piece than a poster.
Mm-hmm. What else do we notice?
There's like depth to it. There's like mostly watercolor in the background. They got like the oil in the front.
Good.
This, what do you want to call it? Depth of field.
What else do we notice?
There's a unique, like, not like binding, but what's the word I'm looking for? Like around the industrial exposition, like a banner, that's what I was trying to say.
Sure. Notice how the type is now curving. How we don't have to constrain ourselves to working in horizontal areas because we don't have any blocks that are forcing us into a gridded formation. Now the type can bend. That the type can start to create even more exaggerated curlicues and elements into it, but we also have a lot more white space. The reason for these posters look so different from wood-type posters was the people that were creating them had to be artists. There was no way around it. You didn't have tradesmen that were, their job was to crank things out quickly. You had artists who actually knew how to draw figurative forms and knew about shading and knew about eye movement. If we look at this poster and we just look at the composition, we can see that the eye movement is very strong here as opposed to what those wood-type posters are. Our eye is kind of circling through this area over and over again, whereas those wood-type posters are eyes start to the top, to the bottom, to the side, to over and over, and we just didn't know where we were supposed to look. This keeps us the eye contained, and that's because these people that were doing this were trained artists. What were you going to say?
It also gives a better idea what the advertisement was for with the picture.
Exactly. So the idea of incorporating illustration into the posters was very, very popular. People loved this idea of having an illustration because even when we were looking at that hoarding site, the one thing that somebody pointed out was that there were images, that there were illustrations in them. And those were the ones that drew more attention than the ones that were just straight typography. So this is the idea of incorporating illustration into the posters, very, very intrinsic and very, very instrumental in pushing the idea of lithography forward. Further, this kind of design could be done in multiple kinds of mediums. So you weren't just stuck with printing on paper. Now you could print on enamel that could then be melted into metal and bent into shapes. So you could create these tins. So here's a couple of tins that are lithographed in the same manner from this period of time. And you can see that the image is embedded into it. Wood type or even letterpress would have to be using a heavy kind of paper because if you used a lightweight paper on letterpress or wood type, it would the letters would start to push through and you would tear the paper. So you had to use a heavy paper for letterpress if you did that on here, chances are that the glue would start to pop up and you would lose the wrap that was on the cans. Whereas this, it was embedded into the can. And what ended up happening was people started to recognize brands from the advertisement on the cans. So it's no longer just an empty tin or a blank tin with maybe a label that might pop off of it. Instead, it was embedded into the cans, and this is the beginning where people started to develop brand loyalties and started to pay attention to who the advertiser or who the maker was of different products. So that was important also as a selling point for lithography. And then there was also scale. Wood type, the wood type people, they decided that they were going to fight this. That what was happening was actually I should show this one. What was happening was that they were finding that more and more people were choosing lithography, even though lithography took much more time to produce. You'd have to produce much larger quantities in order to offset the cost of it. That people were still choosing lithography as a printing means because it was so superior as far as quality goes. And so what the wood type folks started to do is they did create more illustrations. They did start to consider their designs, and they created something called billboarding, where they would take not just one printed piece, but another piece of paper and tab it to the other one and just start to stack and make their images larger and larger and larger. The problem with this is if they could do it, so could lithography. So lithography also started to do things where they were billboarding together. And so now we started to create truly things that were posters that were the size of billboards. They became larger and larger, and they were pieced together as different segments. And so this didn't take away the woes of the people that were working for the printing companies and the letterpress operators. By between 1860 and 1890, the competition between printing and letterpress versus lithography was fierce. And by the time we get to 1900, the letterpress industry is pretty much wiped out. It no longer exists. To this day, we have very few letterpress operators. If you're trying to do something and produce it using that old-fashioned method of letterpress or wood type, you're going to find very few printers around that will do it. Now the industry is filled with printers that do lithography, or now the newest one, digital printing, which is still based upon the idea of lithography. So that's what I've got to cover for today. Wednesday's class, we're going to talk about the invention of photography. Are there any questions on any of the materials?
Yes, could you please post your PowerPoint presentation on Blackboard so we get the visuals? You know, your PowerPoint file, just upload the Blackboard so we can all get your visuals and the notes and everything.
You mean for testing purposes?
Yeah, just some retention, because like we have all our notes, we don't have the pictures, so.
I don't have these recorded.
No, I mean, no, just your PowerPoint file.
I'll think about it. I'll think about it. I kind of have a copyright on it, so it's like kind of like I don't want to put it out on publish my PowerPoint documents.
Okay.
I get what you're saying. I've made it so that when you're tested, all of the images that you're going to be tested on are already existing in your book.
Okay.
So you do have access to your book and all the images that will be on the test.
Yeah.
There will be no images.
Whoa, you alright? Oh dear.
You okay, hon?
Yep, I just tripped on the backpack.
Oh god, I'm sorry.
I thought I stepped over it when I put on it.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. All the there will be no images on this next test, on this first test, but then any images that you do have in the test will be images that are found in your textbook. So there's no